Walking with Jesus through the Gospels. We're with Jesus in his long day, Tuesday, and he's on the Mount of Olives in Matthew chapter 24 as he's answering the question from his disciples regarding the end of the age. So they ask him in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So he's going to respond to them in reference to his declaration that the stones of the buildings, particularly the temple, they're going to be thrown down so that there won't be one on top of the other. And then they want to know what will be the sign of your coming. They are anticipating that the one will take place at the same time as the other. In other words, both of these things will occur simultaneously, or one will lead directly into the other. We saw some aspects that Jesus was detailing, and Matthew then gives us in verse 9 saying, "Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death," and following that gives more details regarding the tribulation, things that will be taking place and evident and obvious, and which leads up then to his second coming. Luke in chapter 21 deals with some of those same aspects, but he says in verse 12, "But before these things." So we can turn to Luke chapter 21 for a moment, where we see, he says, "But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you," and continues on. And we saw that Jesus then spoke about the desolation of Jerusalem, which would take place in 40 years from where we are with Jesus at this point. So he's prophesying. There's a difference. If somebody says that Jesus predicted things, there's a difference between prediction and prophecy. Prediction is somebody's best guess at what an outcome might be or the result might be down the road. Prophecy is that which is of God and isn't predicting, but it is telling in advance the things that will absolutely take place. So here's what Jesus is doing. He's prophesying. Do you remember that Jesus had spoken regarding the Pharisees and the scribes, referring to them as hypocrites? And he says regarding them back in chapter 23, "You who kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to it." So Jesus, when he came, he fulfilled that role as prophet. And he's continuing to prophesy even here. And he will do so until his crucifixion. So he's going to be prophesying right up until then, things that will be taking place. He's going to tell once again that he will be crucified before it takes place, the fourth time that he has done so, at least that we have record of. He'll be prophesying more things during his trial before Caiaphas and Annas and the other members of the Sanhedrin. We'll get to those things when we come to it, but suffice it to see that Jesus is fulfilling that role as prophet. Then at his death, he will be filling that role as priest. And upon his second coming, he will fill the role as, if we want to keep the P theme going, potentate or king. Potentate means one who is all-powerful, rules with all authority. So he will return to rule as king, or the Messiah. So as prophet, he says that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. And that is what Luke details for us. And it does take place, just as Jesus said. So that is now history. The remaining parts of what Jesus speaks about in the latter part of Luke chapter 21, and as it continues in Matthew chapter 24, 4, particularly verses 15 and onwards, is all future events that Jesus has spoken about before they've taken place. So prophecy is history, telling history before it happens. Would you look with me in Luke 21 and see that after Jesus says that Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled, meaning the influence and the power and the rule of the Gentiles over Jerusalem specifically, but as that impacts the broader land of Israel. So, of course, that will take place until the return of Christ. Then he details some events of verse 25. There will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and on the earth distress of nations, in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves, people fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is coming on the world. For the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. This parallels what Jesus is speaking about in chapter 24, looking at verse 29. Now, we're going to be doing a lot of comparison between Luke and Matthew. We're going to be looking at some other New Testament writers as well as they draw on Jesus' teaching here regarding the end times. We'll also be looking at the Old Testament as that is the basis for what Jesus is drawing from and why he has come to fulfill these prophecies at his first coming and to complete them at his second. Well, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. And so we see similarly details that Luke is recording for us. Verse 27, they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. Matthew is filling in or giving more details than what Luke has given us, and Mark carbon copies some of the things that Matthew has spoken about. So we're not really drawing our attention to Mark because what he speaks, Matthew speaks that and more. So with that in mind, I'd like for us to go back to verse 8 of Matthew 24. Verse 8, Matthew 24. Jesus says all these things, so he's speaking about people coming in his name, saying, I'm the Christ, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, nation rising against nation. And he says these are the beginning of birth pains. Paul uses that same phrase, birth pains, as he's talking about the end times. He gives a detailed look at that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, really beginning at verse 13 onwards through the end of chapter 5. But when we come into chapter 5, which is referring to his second coming in a broader sense, whereas chapter 4 is speaking about the taking up, the catching up of the church, the rapture, the harpazo in the Greek of the church, and in the Latin is where we get the word for rapture. So Paul refers to that coming of Christ as birth pains, labor pains. It's the same word that Jesus is using here. And the reason it's the same wording that Jesus uses. The reason I bring this up is because what Paul speaks about and what Peter speaks about in their letters regarding the second coming of Christ and the rapture of the church is drawn directly from what Jesus is teaching here. So Paul is not the first one to teach the rapture. Jesus is. It's not seen just yet, but we'll be coming to it throughout this teaching from the Mount of Olives. We go ahead to verse 15, still in Matthew 24. We're not going to be looking at every verse in detail in this teaching, but we're going to be looking at some portions of it in greater detail, because this is our Lord speaking about his return. And it's important to realize that this is being given to his disciples at the end of his 3.5 years of ministry, but just days before he goes to the cross. And then he will be instructing them more fully according to his fulfillment of all of the scriptures up till that point, at his resurrection, and of course what will be taking place at his second coming. But his focus is preparing his disciples to bring the gospel to the nations and preparing them to always have their eyes looking upward for his return. So Jesus, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now, I mentioned this last week that Matthew doesn't insert this as the writer, let the reader understand. These are the words of Jesus telling us, let the reader of Daniel understand what that abomination of desolation is referring to and what it's regarding. It's not the desolation of Jerusalem that he speaks about in Luke chapter 21, and we dealt with that last week. So let the reader understand. Let's go to Daniel chapter 9, because we want to be among those readers who, one, are reading it, and two, are understanding it. Jesus doesn't make mention of Daniel just for the sake of dropping a name. He's doing it because through the prophet Daniel, Jesus, the Word of God, has given to him the words to write down, to record for us regarding what will be taking place in the end times. So let's pick it up in verse 24. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. And after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and shall have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And he shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall put an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abominations shall come one who makes desolate until the decreed end is poured out on the desolator, or the one who makes desolate. Daniel is being given a word here that is directed to, in verse 24, who is it being given to? It's decreed for your people and your holy city. So the people of Daniel are the Jews, and their holy city is Jerusalem. When Jesus is speaking in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and in Luke chapter 21, and Luke chapter 17, and chapter 19, when he speaks about Jerusalem, when he speaks about these things that are coming upon them, he's speaking to the Jewish people. If you notice in Matthew chapter 24, after Jesus talks about understanding this abomination that causes desolation that Daniel the prophet spoke about, he says, when that takes place, Those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Everything that Jesus is speaking about in this context of what's happening here is Jewish in nature. So speaking about what Daniel had prophesied is to the Jewish people. It's about their city of Jerusalem. The timing, the time frame is in reference to the Jews. So this prophetic time clock is connected directly to the Jews and to the land of Israel, and more specifically, even to the city of Jerusalem. The time frame that Daniel gives us are the 70 weeks are decreed. And he says that there shall be 7 weeks and then 62, and you put them together, it's 69 weeks. And these are weeks of years. So 483 years are indicated for this first portion, which would bring us up to the time from when the decree is made until the time that Christ would be going to the cross. He enters into Jerusalem, riding on the donkey as the anointed king, but the one who the people have not received as far as the leadership is concerned. And so he's going to be the priest before he actually takes his throne as the king. But he's the anointed one nonetheless. And then there will be 1 week of years left to be fulfilled, and that's what Jesus is speaking about regarding the desolation that was the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by Daniel, which occurs midway through that 7-year tribulation. Daniel chapter 11 also speaks about this abomination that causes desolation. It's found in verse 31 of chapter 11. Up until this point in chapter 11, he's speaking about the one who would profane the temple, but it would occur prior to the coming of Jesus, and it was fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, or 167 BC. When we see in verse 31, forces from him, the Antichrist, shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So further details regarding what was given in Daniel chapter 9. Then we come down to Daniel chapter 12, and in verse 11, we read here, and from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, so it's referring back to Daniel 9, verse 27, chapter 11, and verse 31. It's taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up. There shall be 1,290 days. So 3 times it's spoken about here. And Daniel 9 specifically speaks about the one who in the wing of the abominations. It's an abomination because the world ruler, the Antichrist, will have desolated it. He would have brought in an abominable sacrifice, an image of himself, and erected there. And we read more of that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. If we were looking at end time study and prophecy exclusively, that we would be looking at all of these aspects in our study. But we want to simply get a grasp and a good idea of what Jesus is speaking about here, so that we're not just reading words that he's giving us in Matthew and Mark and Luke and walking away. So what does that mean, or how does that fit into end times timeline and sequence of events? We'll come back to Matthew chapter 24. We had seen much of what had been taking place in verses 15 through 28 last week, but I do want to highlight some things. In verse 21, we see that there will be great tribulation from the time of the abomination that causes desolation that's set up in the temple, which is yet future because we don't have a temple in Jerusalem today. Then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. This is not just difficulties or distress that Jesus had spoken about in Luke 21 with the desolation of Jerusalem. This is a time of tribulation, great tribulation, as the world has never seen up until the time Jesus spoke it, nor will it ever see again after that time. If those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. So this is how devastating those days are going to be. Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 7 speaks about it as the time of Jacob's trouble. In Daniel chapter 12 and verse 1, of course, where we just were, he speaks about it in this way, where he says, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation until that time." So this is an incredibly devastating time. But it's because the wrath of God is going to be poured out upon the inhabitants of the earth. Verse 22 in Matthew says, "And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Who are the elect that are being spoken of here? Well, the elect or chosen can be spoken of as angels, can be spoken of as Israel, can be spoken of as the church, the saints of God. In this context, it's speaking about Israel. Let's have a look at a couple of aspects regarding this. Can we go to Deuteronomy chapter 7? Now, keep in mind that Daniel had said that this word is for your people and for your holy city. So in that same context, it's still referring to the Jewish people. And so for the sake of the elect, who are the elect? They're the ones that Jesus is going to come back, the Jews specifically, who will acknowledge him as Messiah, the ones who will say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." The very people that Jesus had spoken about at the close of Matthew chapter 23, that he said, "And you will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" And so those are the elect that Jesus is referring to. But for the sake of the Jewish people, the remnant, I will cut those days short. It doesn't mean that it'll be less than the 7 years that are prophesied in tribulation. It means that if those years, if those days were permitted to continue on, that there would be an absolute extinction of the human race. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 7. The Lord is speaking about the people of Israel. He says that I've called you as a chosen people out of all the peoples or on the face of the earth, and it was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of all peoples. It's that same word in the Greek Septuagint that's being used here, the elect, the chosen. So when we see this word being used of the elect, for the sake of the remnant, those of Israel that will be saved, I will cut those days short. In other words, I won't let them go beyond those 7 years. We see the elect referred to again in verse 31. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. They are still Israel that's being spoken of there as the elect. We'll deal with that more in just a few minutes. I wanted to draw the connection for you as we're looking at it right now, so that when we get to verse 31, you will have that mental note, and I will remind you about it when we get there. So Jesus is telling them in verses 23 down through 27 that it's going to be an obvious thing when I return. It's not going to need to be pointed out. Verse 23, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. And so speaking about the people of Israel, to deceive them, because they're the ones that will be looking for the Messiah. And when we were in Brooklyn, there was right beside the apartment where we were staying a synagogue that was being rebuilt. That had suffered a fire, but a rabbi had set himself up in Brooklyn, became world famous, and after his death, his followers started calling him, and even to this day, refer to him as the Messiah. They believe that he is the Messiah, but he hasn't risen from the dead, and there's no promise of his return. But there are still many. If you did a search online for messiahs today, you would find a pretty hefty list regarding people who claim to be messiahs all across the globe. But Israel is looking for a deliverer, looking for somebody who will bring them salvation. So he says, don't be led astray when people start saying these things, because when I return, you won't need anyone to tell you that this is that event. It's going to be like when the lightning flashes and it hits across the entire sky, lights up the entire sky, that nobody needs to say to you, that I think there's lightning out there. It's obvious of what's going on. So he says, if somebody's saying, look here or there, the wilderness or in the inner rooms, don't believe it. So the Son of Man, when he returns, his coming is going to be without question. So don't allow, even if you hear these reports, wonderings, is this that? Is this the return of Christ? Was that his second coming? Those that might say different time frames. I know the majority that are listening to this are already aware of this, but you may be new to the scriptures, to the Word of God. And maybe you've heard some making claims and you've wondered what this is all about. When Jesus returns at his second coming, it will be so obvious there won't be any need of anyone saying that this is what that is. In verse 29, he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So there's no provision here for an interval to take place between the end of those days and the return of Christ. So there's nothing going to transpire at the end of that and some other events that will be going on before Christ returns. So immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened. And this is where we began looking at the parallel between Luke 21 and here in Matthew chapter 24. But he says that with all of these things taking place, and you read about it in the book of Revelation in even greater detail, he says, when you see the moon won't give its light and the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heavens will be shaken, then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And this is the sign of the Son of Man. The Son of Man will be coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And this is a picture that only God is described as the one who comes with the clouds or rides on the clouds. We see it in the Psalms. We see it in Daniel chapter 7 regarding the throne room of God, and the Son of Man who comes with the clouds or on the clouds. And so he'll be coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So he's still prophesying of what's going to be taking place and how his return will occur. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. How do we know that this is still speaking about Israel and not the saints, the church at this point? Well, because this is the end of the tribulation. And it's the Jews, the remnant, the believing Jews who have joined together, most of them at the place prepared for them in the mountains, in Petra, but also the rest of the Jews that were at different points across the globe. Have a look back in Deuteronomy one more time, and let's have a look at chapter 30. You see the similar wording that is being used here, that Jesus is drawing on. Deuteronomy chapter 30. I'd like to take it from the first verse so that we get a feel for the context. So Moses is speaking to them and says, "And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today, with all your heart, with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you." So he's speaking about there will be a time when they will be scattered across the entire globe. But I want us to see particularly in verse 4. "If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will take you." It doesn't mean that they've gone to heaven. It means that the uttermost parts that are under the heaven, or to the extent of heaven. So from the north, the south, the east, and the west. Or another way of saying it is from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So that the Lord will regather all of his elect, specifically the Jews, and bring them at the time of his coming to that gathering place in Jerusalem. See, it's because of Israel's persistent rebellion against God that he had declared that he would scatter the Jews into all the winds. We can read about that in Ezekiel chapter 5, verses 10 and 12. He also says that he will scatter them toward all winds, again in Ezekiel chapter 17 and verse 21. And lastly, in Zechariah chapter 2 and verse 6, speaks of scattered them abroad as four winds of the heavens, speaking about the Jews who have been scattered abroad. So here Jesus is saying that there will be a loud trumpet call, and the angels will gather his elect from the four winds, from all points on the earth, bringing them to that one place where he will judge the nations in Jerusalem, the valley of Jehoshaphat, as Joel speaks about it, and then establishes his throne in Jerusalem. And there are many other verses that we could look at regarding the loud trumpet that is going to be given in Isaiah chapter 27 and verse 13 to bring the elect, the Jews, back together again. This is not the same trumpet that's being spoken of in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that there will be the last trumpet, the call of God, where that we will be changed, the dead will rise, and that we will be changed and put on immortality. That's in reference to the rapture, when those that are dead in Christ will rise, those that are alive. Paul also speaks about it in 1 Thessalonians 4, that we'll be caught up to meet the Lord in the air. So the last trumpet that Paul speaks about in 1 Corinthians, with the resurrection of the saints, the church, those that will be raised imperishable, will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. For those that are alive, have not yet fallen asleep. It's the term that Paul uses to speak about believers in Jesus who have died. What we see is that it's not the same as that last trumpet, it's referring to the rapture, and it's not the same as the seventh trumpet of the trumpet judgments in Revelation, because in that seventh or the last trumpet is a trumpet of judgment and devastation and destruction upon the earth, and it's not one of rescue. A picture that we can see here regarding a trumpet. Let's have a look at the screen. This is the western wall of the Temple Mount. We had seen this last week when we looked at some of the concept regarding Jesus speaking about the temple. The buildings would have no stone left upon the other. Well, these are the ruins, the remnants of many of those stones from that retaining wall even that were thrown down to the street below. So this is looking back to the southwest corner. So this place right here is the south and this wall is the west. So the southwestern corner. If you look at a model of the Temple Mount from the time of Christ, this is that southwestern corner that you were just looking at. So at this point is the southwestern corner. And the street below is where all of that rubble was was gathered. The street below right here is where all of that rubble is collected and fallen. You see another vantage point of that. So the southwest corner is the top part there going all the way to the base. And the reason that I have this circled, you'll see in just a moment. But all of that debris from stones, all of these rocks and stones were tumbled over. This is the street below, and this arch doesn't exist today except for just a little outjut on the wall. And again, one more vantage point of that, the southwest corner. Why do I bring attention to the southwest corner? Well, because in 1968, there was a discovery that this rock right here, this is an artist's depiction of that southwestern corner, and you see some writing in Hebrew on that. Well, in 1968, there was an archaeologist who had dug through those stones and the rubble that was there and discovered this inscription on the cornerstone of that upper point. It's not very visible in this picture because it's faint, but let me bring it in a little bit more clearly. There is that inscription. And of course, the stone is broken away and the rest of it is not, we don't know where it is or if it even exists today. But here's that inscription. Let's have a look at what it says. It says Lebeit, so it reads from right to left. Lebeit, Hatikia, and then Le. So here's what that means. We have Lebeit, Hatikia, Le, to the house or to the place. And then the second word is of trumpeting. This last word, the lettering of the third letter that I haven't highlighted, the scholars can't determine what that letter is or what that word was, but there's best guess is it was likely one of two words that spoke of one, to distinguish, or to declare. In other words, to declare the time of the Sabbath. And so this inscription literally means to the trumpeting place. The place that was to declare or distinguish, to announce the arrival of the Sabbath. And here's what would happen on the sixth day, so Friday, coming into the time of Sabbath, that there would be 7 times the priest would blow that trumpet from that southwestern corner. And the first time was coming into the later afternoon, and it was to draw attention to those who are in the fields far away, that time is drawing near for the Sabbath to begin. So start closing down your work and make preparation to get back into the city or back to your houses. The second time it was blown, it was for those who are closer to the city, and whether their homes were outside of the city wall or inside of the city, that you need to start making your way back to your houses. The third time was for those who were right outside the city walls, but they live inside the city. And it was make way to your house, really is what that was speaking to them. And then the fourth time, you're getting closer now to the Sabbath beginning, was for those that were within the walls. And then the fifth time is for those now you've gotten into your houses, or perhaps you've been in your house all along, but the fifth blast of that shofar, that trumpet, was to say, make sure you're getting ready for the Sabbath. The sixth blast is set the table. Make sure everything's in place, because no more work could be done once that seventh blast was given, because with the seventh blast, it was a declaration that the Sabbath, the rest, is what Sabbath means, the Shabbat, has arrived. No more work, no more travel. You need to be in your place, because it's a time of rest and it's a time of worship of God. And that's what this idea of trumpet is, the trumpeting. If we look at verses 32 to 35, Jesus gives us a picture here. It's a picture of the fig tree. He says, learn a lesson from the fig tree, and as soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is here. Jesus is saying, just as you know from looking at fig trees, the leaves are coming out, you know that summer is just about here. In the same way, when you see these things beginning to happen, look at verse 33. When you see these things, you know that he is near. Who is he? It's speaking about himself, the Son of Man. At the very gates, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. We had seen that the fig tree back in chapter 21, Mark dealt with it and so did Luke, that the fig tree was a reference to the religious leaders, the leaders of Israel. It represented Israel itself. So we see in similar fashion that Jesus is using this symbol. And when you see the fig tree, learn its lesson. When you see Israel coming back to her fullness, the leaf is coming out, it's beginning to fruit, if you will. Because at the time of Christ, it was not a nation. And shortly after the destruction of the temple, then the peoples would be dispersed and the city would be destroyed. And since that time, Israel really hasn't had a place to call its own until 1948, when Israel became an established state in the Middle East. But even today, they don't fill all of the land that was promised to them by God in covenant to their forefather Abraham. So even so, when 1948 happened, they came together as a nation. And with that rebirth of the nation, as it were, that Jesus is saying, be alert, watch. When you see these things happen, know that he is near. Well, you look at this and you say, what about this idea that this generation will not pass away until all these things take place? There have been numerous speculations as to what the generation means, who the generation is that is being referred to. How long is a generation? Is it somebody's lifetime, a lifespan? Is it 40 years? Is it 20 years? We'll let Scripture at least inform us on this one respect in Genesis chapter 15. Let's go there for a moment. Genesis chapter 15. And we're looking at verses 13 through 16. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on that nation that they serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So the time frame that the Lord is speaking to Abraham regarding this is 400 years. Do you see that in verse 13? That they'll be afflicted for 400 years. And then we're told that in the 4th generation that they shall come back to the land. That tells us that there will be 4 generations during those 400 years, meaning that they are a duration of 100 years. So very easily, we are well within the confines of what we see from the very beginning, the inception of the Jews through Abraham and the promise that was given to him, that they would come back to that land. And we see that the generation indicated there was 100 years. So we're within that 100-year period for sure. It says that this generation will not pass away. We can get even more specific than that. So we have seen that the nation, the people of Israel, have gathered together. They have been reformed as a nation, an entity on earth, a geographical location, a geographical nation, a political nation. And when Jesus speaks about this in Luke's gospel, let's have a look there. In Luke chapter 21, we see in verse 29, he speaks about the fig tree. But in this respect, he says, look at the fig tree and all the trees. As soon as they come out in leaf, you see for yourselves and know that the summer is already here. And I think that what Jesus is doing here is that he's given a twofold aspect. That when you see Israel coming into leaf, the fig tree, that you know that the time is at hand, the generation, so within 100 years. And all of the trees. And we see that these things are going to be coming upon the earth. All of these things, verse 33 of Matthew 24. When you see all these things, what things? The things that he's been speaking about specifically from 15 onwards. You see these wars, even before that, but you see the wars, you see the desolation, abomination that causes desolation set up. You know that those who see those things take place in that 7-year period, that generation will not pass away. So that's in reference to all of the trees. So we have the tree, the fig tree, Israel. We have all of the trees showing what's being brought upon the inhabitants of the earth. That coming into these things, when you see these things begin to take place, that you know that this generation is not going to pass away before the Lord returns. He says, and this is as sure as my word, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Why does he say that here? He's saying it because this is a sure word. It's not one that he's grasping for details or trying to manufacture things that may or may not happen. He's saying, I'm telling you exactly as it will take place. And of course, he hasn't given every single detail, but the details that he has given are accurate and they will occur, even as he has spoken them and told us about them. When we look at verse 36, he says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son. What is Jesus referring to here? See, up until this point, he's been speaking about things that we can know and timing that we can know. And we look at verses 32 to 35, as we've just done, he says, you can know these things. Verse 32, learn its lesson. When you see the fig tree's its branches become tender, it puts out leaves, you know summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, the things that Jesus has been speaking about, you know that he is near at the very gates. So we know from Scripture that when these things begin to happen, that it's going to be a period of 7 years. from the Antichrist, the world leader, the ruler from the people, not the Jews, but the ruler from the people, the Gentiles, the Romans, that he will establish a covenant with the people of the city of Jerusalem. And that will initiate the 7th week of Daniel, the tribulation period. And at the midway point, he will set up the abomination that causes desolation. And there will be 42 more months. And Jesus will return, 1,260 days, and he will return. We read about that in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14. These are the words being given to John, the apostle. 3.5 years, we see 1,260 days in Revelation chapter 13. And more dates similar to that throughout the book of Daniel and elsewhere throughout the book of Revelation. So we know the timing of Jesus' return. Once they see these things happening, you can know the time of his return. But in verse 36, he says, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows. So you cannot know those things that he speaks about from verse 36 on to chapter 25 and verse 13. You can't know the timing of the day that he will return. In verse 29 of chapter 24, he says, immediately after tribulation of those days. So it's a lengthy period of time, those days. So all those days during that tribulation, the wrath of God being poured out. Then he zeroes in more with even greater detail. It's like what the Lord does in Genesis chapters 1 and then chapter 2. Chapter 1 is a general overview of the creation event. And then chapter 2, he zeroes in on certain aspects of what he did during that creation week to emphasize various aspects and relationship with man and beginning of various things with his relationship with humankind. And this is similar to that. Jesus has been given this overview of those end days of his return. Now in verse 36, he is zeroing in on one aspect of that, which is prior to the beginning of that 7th week of Daniel. The 70th week of Daniel, that last week, those 7 days. There is in Greek, when it says, but concerning, it's the word in Greek is peride, Peride. And when that's used, it's indicating, a new section of thought. It's used also by Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And Paul is dealing with end times details which he received from the Lord. It's in chapter 5, it's a new subject, but it's complementary to what he had spoken about in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Chapter 4, it's speaking about the rapture, the catching up of the church. In chapter 5, it's more broad concerning that second coming of the Lord to come in judgment. So this but concerning, or perhaps your translation says now concerning, it changes the discussion of the preceding signs, the coming, to emphasize that no signs precede this secret coming, if you will, the coming of the Lord, as Paul details it in 1 Thessalonians 4, that he's coming to catch us up to meet him in the air. No signs given, no signs preceding it. I'll mention it here, and we'll pick this aspect of it next time we're together. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 to 44, the parallels that are involved in both of those aspects are very precise and very detailed. Would you look at verse 44 of Matthew 24? Therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. This is closely connected, hand in hand with verse 36. Nobody knows that day or the hour, not even the angels of heaven. And at that point, not even Jesus himself. And whether he has taken on that knowledge now that he has ascended and sits at the right hand of the Father, or he still chooses to keep that at bay until the time that the Father has already predetermined that Jesus is going to come to take us to be with himself. Paul tells us that in 1 Thessalonians 5:4 that that day would overtake us like a thief. We need to be aware that Jesus coming to rapture the church is without sign. You can't look at events in the world, even with the wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and other events that are going on. Those are the beginning of birth pains. And it gives us the indication, even with the rebirth of the nation of Israel in its land, although not all of the land that will be hers when Jesus rules as king. But even with all of those taking place, those are birth pangs beginning and indicators that keep your eyes on Jesus. Don't get caught up in those things, get caught up with him, so that when he comes, you will be caught up in a sense, that you will be raptured. Now, when he speaks about being ready, he says that we need to have preparation so that it's a believing upon him for salvation. That is our preparation. If we choose not to believe in him, then we will be left behind. And Lord willing, if that happens, that you will, and those that remain will come to faith in Jesus Christ. But if you're one who says, I'll wait because when he returns, I'll still have at least 7 years. If you aren't believing now, if you're not ready to trust him now, the likelihood of you wanting to trust him or going to trust him with your life at that point, as the scripture says, you'll send a strong delusion that those that remain will believe a lie, that you may be one of those ones that will be deluded and your lost soul, as you are now, may remain lost for eternity. Don't take the chance. Give your life to Jesus Christ today. In verse 30, so most of our focus here now is Matthew chapter 24. In verse 30, it says, Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man, what's the word there? Coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Well, that's referring to the obvious return of Christ, where he will establish his throne in Jerusalem. When we come down now to verse 37, for as were the days of Noah, so will be this coming of the Son of Man. So we have in English the word coming in both of those verses, in verse 30 and verse 37. But it's two different words in the Greek. Now, we're not looking to split hairs here, but in verse 30, it speaks about the second coming of the Lord at his appearing. In verse 37, it covers a wider span, meaning that it takes in the appearing of the Lord to the church, where he come in the clouds, take us to meet him in the clouds, but he's not yet revealed himself to the earth. At his second coming, every eye will see him. At his coming to take the church to be with him, only those who are his will see him, and we will be caught up to meet him in the air. Let's look at verse 37 to 39. For as were the days of Noah, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark, and they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So Jesus is likening this coming to the experience, the events that took place when Noah and the flood occurred. But there's some details here that we need to see that it shows us this is in reference to the rapture of the church. This is not the second coming. He's not coming at this point in judgment. He's coming at this point to take the church to be with himself. Notice, for as in the days of Noah, the coming of the Son of Man will be the same or similar. Because in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying and giving in marriage. This is not going to be the case coming on throughout the tribulation, and particularly the second half of the tribulation. There is going to be such upheaval and devastation, as we've already read. The Great Tribulation is going to be such that if it was not for the sake of the elect and the days shortened, that no one would survive. So there's not going to be life going on as per usual, that there are obvious catastrophic events that people say nowadays when there's a massive flood or earthquake or hurricane types of events, that they would say that though the storm or the event was of biblical proportions, because they say it was so huge. But church, what will be encountered and experienced during the Great Tribulation will make those former events look small in comparison. Noah's flood. It's speaking about the time leading up to this sudden arrival of the day of the Lord in the 70th week of Daniel. So leading up to those things. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7 says this, that Noah was warned by God concerning events as yet unseen. So there was no evidence of flood. There was no evidence of what Noah was speaking about. He was warned regarding events that up until the flood itself, they were unseen. So what Jesus is speaking about here is when he comes for his bride, the church, that the events that he was speaking about with the various signs from the abomination that causes desolation and the sun being darkened, the moon not giving its light, and the stars falling from heaven, etc., that we've not seen any of that taking place. And that won't occur until after that which is similar in judgment to the flood itself. Up until the time of the flood, God was still exhibiting patience towards mankind. But he had said in Genesis that he would not strive with man forever. Is it chapter 6? That my spirit will not strive with man always. It will be 120 years. So at the end of that 120 years, we see that the patience of God had reached its pre-spoken, his prophesied point. He had decreed that you've got 120 years. And it's not that God ceased being patient. It meant that that was the period of time for them to experience his grace. And after that, there would be judgment. And the judgment came with the rain that began to fall, not prior to the rain beginning to fall. So when we see that that parallel with what Jesus is speaking about, there's no judgment coming upon the inhabitants of the earth until after the church is taken to be with him. Can we look at one more passage of Scripture? And then we're going to press the pause button, and we'll resume this next week. In 2 Peter chapter 3, Second Peter and chapter 3. We're looking at verses 9 and 10. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, and then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. See, that's what is yet future, and that's what will be coming much later after the return of Christ, after the catching up of the church to be with Christ. And then further on, even after the millennial reign, at the end of that, this will be bringing some of that judgment into what is going to be brought upon the earth. Up until the time of the tribulation, God is giving out his grace. He's patient with man. But what Jesus is saying, there's a time of judgment, the time of God's wrath is going to be poured out upon the earth, like the days of Noah when the flood came. Up until the flood, people had opportunity to respond and to be saved in that ark, by the ark. But once that door was shut and the rain began to fall, there was no further opportunity for them to come into the ark. The interesting thing is that in Genesis chapter 7, we read that God called for the animals to come 2 by 2, and then the clean animals were 7 of each, and brought them to Noah. They were brought into the ark. I believe it's in verse 3 and then again in verse 10, speaks about the fact that 7 days before the rains began, that God brought even Noah and his family inside of the ark, and God himself closed the door. And so 7 days prior to the judgment coming upon, where this is a picture of that 7-year period, that last week of the wrath of God being poured out upon the earth, that Noah and his family were kept safe in the ark. Not out, they weren't saved from the flood itself. They weren't saved from several drops of water or from a downpour of water, and then they made their way to the ark to avoid the judgment that was coming upon the earth. They were in 7 days prior, speaking about that rest of God. 7 speaks about that rest, the 7th day. And it gives a picture then, as Jesus is making the parallel, even as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. That the Son of Man coming for his church. And then when Jesus came the first time, his first coming, it's 30 plus years of his life, but it doesn't just deal with his birth, his conception and his birth, and nor does it just deal with his death and his resurrection. There's various aspects of his first coming. In the same way, there will be aspects of his second coming, and it will span over more than 7 years from the time of the rapture, as detailed, spoken about here in verse 36, onward through to the early parts of chapter 25. And we'll look at that further when we're together next week. But we see these parallels. I want you to look through the scriptures and see where you can see the word flood and see where it connects with Noah and some of the parallels, the similarities that can be seen with what Jesus teaches here from the Mount of Olives and what Peter speaks about in both of his letters. So we'll be looking at that when we come back together next week, so that we can see that those that are being taken are the ones that are being raptured, and the ones being left behind are the ones that are being left to go through the judgment of the tribulation, even as those who were left in the days of Noah were left for judgment, and the waters destroyed them. So when we come together next week, let's continue to keep our eyes on Jesus and the anticipation that we need to be ready. We need to look up, for our redemption is drawing near. So prepare yourself if you're not already. Put your life in his hands. Confess your sin to him. Repent. Acknowledge that you're a sinner, and trust your life to him, and he will save you.